When Bernard Hill passed away, his grand Victorian home in Manchester, a place he'd lived in for decades, stood empty for months. The old house, nestled at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, had a presence about it, tall, gray-bricked, its gabled roof and stained glass windows a relic of another time. Over the years, neighbors whispered about strange occurrences, odd sounds in the dead of night, flickering lights when no one was home. But it wasn't until a young couple, James and Eleanor Parker, bought the house that the rumors turned into something much more unsettling. The Parkers, both in their early 30s, had been searching for an old house with character. They wanted history, a place with soul. They got exactly that. From the moment they moved in, the atmosphere inside the house felt different. Not oppressive, but not quite welcoming either. The air was thick with something unspoken. Eleanor, a historian with a passion for old homes, brushed it off as adjustment jitters. James, a software developer who didn't believe in ghosts, laughed at the idea of a haunted house. Then the knocking started. First it was soft, a rhythmic tap-tap-tap from the walls at odd hours. Sometimes in the bedroom, sometimes in the hallway. The first night James went to investigate, he found nothing but silence and the faint smell of old wood. They blamed the pipes, the house settling until the knocks started answering them. One evening, James was alone in the study, the dim glow of his laptop casting long shadows. He tapped his fingers absent-mindedly on the wooden desk. A moment later, from the far wall, came a reply. 3 taps. Deliberate. Measured. He froze. He tapped twice. 2 taps answered back. Eleanor, meanwhile, was experiencing something else entirely. She had taken to exploring the attic, where old belongings from past owners had been left behind. Among them, she found a dusty leather-bound journal. The name embossed on the cover read B. Hill. Flipping through the brittle pages, she found sketches of the house, notes about its history, and cryptic messages scrawled in the margins. She watches from the window. The air feels heavier today. I am not alone. The more she read, the more she felt something watching her. The feeling was strongest in the upstairs hallway, particularly near the master bedroom. One night, as she passed by, she saw the door to the room swing open on its own. Inside, the antique mirror against the far wall reflected something that made her blood run cold, an outline of a man, standing just behind her. Bernard Hill had been known as a quiet, private man in life. He wasn't cruel nor particularly warm. But now, in death, it seemed he hadn't left his home. The disturbances escalated. Lights flickered in patterns. A shadow moved at the top of the stairs when no one was there. Objects disappeared only to reappear in strange places. Eleanor's reading glasses inside the oven, James's keys in the bathtub, and the knocking never stopped. Then, one night, they heard the voice. A low, guttural whisper seeped through the walls. It wasn't words. Not at first, just a sound. Something between a sigh and a moan. Then it formed into something clearer. Get out. The Parkers did not sleep that night. By morning, they had made a decision. Within a week, the house was listed for sale. By the end of the month, they were gone. The new owners, an older couple from London, were informed of the house's history, but dismissed the stories as superstition. They moved in on a Sunday. By Monday night, they too heard the knocking. The first night in their new home, Margaret and Philip Wainwright settled into the quiet unease of Bernard Hill's house. They had purchased it knowing full well the rumors that swirled around the property. But Philip, a retired professor of philosophy, dismissed the notion of hauntings as nonsense. Margaret, though more sensitive to the subtleties of a place, had convinced herself that whatever had driven the previous owners away had been nothing more than their own fears feeding upon themselves. The house itself was magnificent in an aged, melancholic way. The tall, arched windows cast elongated shadows across the wooden floors, and the intricate molding along the ceilings bore the craftsmanship of another time. The stairs creaked beneath their careful steps, not in a way that suggested decay, but rather a whisper of acknowledgement, as if the house was waking from some long, silent slumber. Margaret had spent the day unpacking, her fingers tracing the edges of old wallpaper, her eyes lingering on the peculiar details of the house, the way the light seemed to dim unnaturally in the upstairs hallway. how the antique mirror in the master bedroom always felt just a little too cold when she passed by it. There was an odd scent in the house, too, one that the movers had noticed when they first arrived, an earthy, damp aroma, as though something old and undisturbed had recently been stirred. By evening, the house was filled with the quiet rustle of new occupants settling in. The fire in the sitting room crackled softly as Philip read from his book, the flames casting a golden glow on his face. Margaret, curled into the corner of the sofa, was knitting, though her hands felt slower than usual, as if something in the air made her sluggish, made the room feel heavier than it should. The wind outside howled against the glass, a deep, groaning sound that sent a shiver down her spine. Then came the first knock, a dull, hollow sound, not at the door, nor from the walls, but from deep within the house itself, like something shifting beneath the floorboards. Margaret froze, her fingers tightening around the yarn. She turned to Philip, expecting him to glance up, to acknowledge the noise, but he continued reading, undisturbed. Perhaps he hadn't heard it. She hesitated, waiting, listening. There it was again. 3 distinct knocks. Slow, purposeful. She swallowed, her breath shallow. "Did you hear that?" Philip turned a page, not even glancing up. "Hear what?" Margaret hesitated, but the sound did not come again. After a moment, she let out a soft, nervous laugh. Nothing. Must have been the wind. And yet, deep inside, she knew better. As the night stretched on, the silence within the house took on a different quality, not a peaceful stillness, but something expectant. The kind of quiet that felt like it was waiting. Margaret woke in the early hours, her sleep restless, her body cold despite the thick blankets around her. The room was darker than it should have been. The dim glow of the street lamp outside barely reached through the heavy curtains, and yet something was different. She sat up, her breath visible in the air. The temperature had dropped unnaturally. The walls, the very bed beneath her, felt like ice. She turned her head, slowly, carefully, toward the antique mirror in the corner of the room, and as she did, she felt the weight of something unseen pressing against her chest. A shape moved in the reflection. Not hers, not Philip's, something else. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Margaret's breath hitched as she stared into the dim glass, her pulse slow and heavy, each beat echoing in the stillness of the room. The shape in the mirror did not belong. It stood slightly to the left, just beyond the reach of logic, a tall, looming figure that seemed to bleed into the shadows rather than stand apart from them. She wanted to move to wake Philip, to tear her gaze from that dreadful, shifting outline, but something deeper, something primal, held her captive. A sensation slithered through her bones, colder than the night air, a whispering pressure at the base of her skull. The figure did not step forward. It did not turn. It merely lingered, its presence filling the room like the weight of forgotten sorrow. The street lamp outside flickered. For the briefest moment, the figure in the mirror sharpened, as though brought into painful focus. It had no face, not in the way a person does. No eyes, no mouth, just a hollow impression where features should have been. A void of shifting darkness framed by the faint suggestion of a man's presence. Margaret's lips parted, but no sound escaped. A dreadful awareness crawled beneath her skin. She was not looking at something past, something left behind. This was not memory imprinted upon the house. This thing in the mirror, it was looking back. And then, before she could even draw breath, the lamp outside flared to life again. The figure was gone. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with an absence that felt more deliberate than natural. The cold in the room remained, wrapping around her like damp cloth, but whatever had been there, whatever had watched her, had receded. Margaret turned, finally, to Philip. He was still asleep, his back to her, breathing slow and steady. She swallowed against the tightness in her throat, the weight in her chest. Perhaps it had been a dream, some conjuration of her own mind, but as she lay back down, the thought rang hollow. The air around her still felt occupied. Sleep did not return easily. The following morning, the house was deceptively ordinary. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, pooling across the wooden floorboards, and the smell of fresh coffee curled in the air. Margaret stood by the kitchen sink, staring out at the frost-kissed garden, her fingers wrapped around a steaming mug. She hadn't told Philip what she had seen. Not yet. The rational part of her urged restraint. It had been a trick of the light, exhaustion, the mind's way of imposing meaning upon shadows. And yet, the feeling hadn't left her. Even now, beneath the comfort of daylight, she could sense it a wrongness just beneath the surface, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Philip, oblivious, was sitting at the small dining table, flipping through an old book he had found in the study the night before. He had been drawn to it immediately, something about the worn leather cover and the peculiar, handwritten notes in the margins. "It's fascinating," he murmured, tapping a passage with his finger. "Whoever lived here before kept detailed records of the house's history. Did you know it was built over an older foundation? Some sort of estate that burned down in the late 1800s. Margaret turned slightly, her grip tightening on the mug. "Did it say what happened?" Philip nodded, adjusting his glasses. "The details are sparse, but there was a man, some sort of caretaker, or perhaps a former owner who died under strange circumstances. There's a mention of his body being found in an upstairs room, though it doesn't specify which one." He turned the page, squinting at the faded ink. "It says his death was ruled an accident, but there were rumors. The neighbors spoke of odd noises in the house even before he died. Scratching in the walls, whispering at night." Margaret stared at him, her pulse a slow, steady drum in her ears. Scratching in the walls. A memory stirred last night's knocking, deep and deliberate. She swallowed. "What else does it say?" Philip exhaled through his nose, flipping another page. "Something about mirrors." Margaret went still. She did not move, did not speak. A slow chill crept along her spine, slithering through her ribs, curling around her lungs. The air in the kitchen felt heavier, suddenly, as though the house itself was listening. Philip continued reading, unaware. Apparently, the caretaker believed the house was watching him. He wrote about seeing things in the mirror's figures, movement, things that weren't really there. He chuckled, shaking his head. Superstitious nonsense, of course. Margaret did not laugh. Her eyes drifted toward the antique mirror in the hallway, just beyond the kitchen door. The glass, bathed in the morning light, should have been empty. It wasn't. The reflection in the hallway mirror was wrong. Margaret didn't move, didn't even breathe as she stared past Philip's shoulder, her eyes locked on the gleaming glass. The image within was almost identical to reality, the golden spill of morning sunlight across the hallway floor, the edges of the kitchen doorway framing it like a picture. Almost, but something was off. A hesitation in the way the light moved. A faint, imperceptible warping at the corners of the mirror's surface, as though the glass itself were not merely reflecting but breathing, shifting, subtly alive. And there near the far end of the hallway stood the shape. Not sharp enough to be fully seen, but not vague enough to be ignored. A figure just on the threshold of definition, its edges bleeding into the background like an ink blot on wet paper. Margaret's fingers tightened around her coffee mug, her knuckles paling. She wanted to look away, to dismiss the image as a trick of light, a figment of morning grogginess, but her body refused to obey. The air in the kitchen had thickened, pressing against her skin like unseen hands. Philip continued reading aloud from the old book, oblivious to the way her body had gone rigid, her breath shallow. The mirrors of the house were said to be unnatural, doors to something else. He believed they watched him in return. His voice drifted, distant, muffled, as if the walls of the house were swallowing the words before they could fully form. Margaret didn't blink. The figure in the mirror had moved. Not much, just enough. Enough for her to know that it wasn't standing still. Her throat was dry, her pulse hammering against her ribs, but she forced herself to take a slow, steady breath. A voice deep in her mind, her own voice, but strained, distant, whispered, "Turn around. See what's really there." But she didn't. Somehow, instinctively, she knew that whatever she saw in the mirror was not the same as what she would see in the hallway. And that terrified her. The clock on the kitchen wall let out a soft tick. The figure in the mirror twitched, its edges flickering like a candle's shadow against the wall. Margaret swallowed against the lump in her throat, her gaze flickering toward Philip. He was still engrossed in the book, his brow furrowed in concentration. He hadn't noticed. She forced herself to speak. "Philip," her voice came out softer than she'd intended, barely above a whisper. She cleared her throat, tried again. "Philip." He finally looked up, blinking at her as though emerging from deep thought. She wanted to tell him. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words tangled in her throat like roots buried in the earth. She couldn't name it, couldn't describe it. Instead, she settled for something simple. The mirrors. Philip's expression remained neutral, though a flicker of curiosity crossed his features. He glanced briefly at the hallway mirror before returning his gaze to her, his lips quirking into a small, amused smile. "What about them?" Margaret hesitated. The reflection had not changed. The figure remained, still and waiting. Waiting for what? She exhaled shakily, forcing herself to blink, breaking the silent standoff between herself and the mirror. "I think we should cover them." Philip chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, come on, love. You're letting the book get to you." Margaret didn't respond. He sighed, setting the book down with a faint thud. "All right, if it makes you feel better, we can cover them." She managed a nod, though the unease in her chest didn't loosen. Philip stood, stretching before moving toward the hallway, toward the mirror. Margaret watched, her breath tight in her lungs. He stepped past the threshold. His reflection did not. For the briefest moment, a heartbeat, a blink, his mirrored image lagged behind, standing still even as his real self moved forward. Then it snapped into place as if it had never been wrong. Margaret's blood ran cold. Philip, unaware, reached up and pulled a linen sheet from a moving box, tossing it carelessly over the mirror. The glass disappeared beneath the fabric, the shape within vanishing as though it had never been there at all. And yet, even as the mirror was concealed, Margaret could still feel it. Presence. Still watching, still waiting. The house had not let go of whatever lingered inside it, and Margaret feared it never would. That night, the house held its breath. The linen sheet over the mirror swayed ever so slightly, though there was no draft, no open window, no logical explanation for the movement. Margaret lay in bed, her eyes locked on the dim shape of it beyond the doorway, her body tense beneath the covers. Philip, of course, had fallen asleep with ease, breathing deep and steady beside her. His skepticism shielded him, insulated him from the weight pressing down on the house, but Margaret felt it. Even now, she could sense it just beyond the edges of sight, lurking in the seams of the darkness. The silence was too perfect, the kind of silence that felt manufactured, as though something was swallowing the usual noises of the night, the ticking of the clock, the distant hum of cars on the main road, even the whisper of wind against the old window panes. Then came the first sound. Faint, delicate rustling. Margaret's fingers curled into the sheets. She knew the noise before she even placed it. The linen over the mirror. It was shifting, not like fabric caught in a stray draft, not like something moving naturally in the night. It was deliberate. Something was behind it, watching. The air in the room thickened, dense and cloying, as though the walls themselves were leaning inward, pressing down. Margaret's breath turned shallow, her pulse slow and syrupy in her veins. She wanted to wake Philip, to reach out and shake him, but she couldn't move, couldn't blink. A single whisper of sound unfurled from the darkness. Not words, not a voice, just a slow, measured breath. It was inside the room. Margaret's stomach twisted, nausea curling in her throat. The sheets over the mirror shifted again, this time lifting just an inch, just enough for her to see the gleam of glass beneath, a sliver of reflection catching the dim light from the hallway. She did not want to see, did not want to know what was standing in that thin, distorted glimpse of the room. But she did. The figure, not standing in the room but just inside the mirror, trapped, waiting. It had no face. The hollow, shadowed imprint of a man loomed in the warped glass, its edges flickering like candlelight. The impression of shoulders, a long coat, an outline of something that was, and wasn't, human. Margaret's breath came in tight, desperate gasps now. She willed herself to move, to break free from whatever invisible weight held her down. But her limbs were sluggish, unresponsive. Then the whisper came again. Closer. Not from the mirror, but from beside the bed. Get out. The words were wet, thick with something unnatural. A breath that did not belong to Philip. Margaret turned her head slow, stiff, unwilling, and in the darkness, she saw a shape, hulking and unnatural, crouched just beyond the bed. Not fully formed, but there, its presence pressing against the fabric of reality, bleeding into the space between wakefulness and nightmare. Then Philip stirred. The second he moved, the weight in the room snapped, shattering like brittle glass. The whisper was gone. The shadow at the bedside was gone. The sheet over the mirror fell still. Margaret gasped in air, her entire body shaking. Philip groaned, rubbing his face. What time is it? Margaret could barely answer. It doesn't matter. Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. We need to leave. Philip, we need to leave. He frowned, still caught in the haze of sleep. Margaret, it's the middle of the night. We need to leave now. Something in her voice cut through his grogginess. He blinked at her, concern flickering in his face, but before he could respond, the mirror shattered. A violent, sickening crack split the air, a sound so loud and sharp that it rattled the walls. Glass exploded outward, shards flinging across the room, embedding themselves in the wood, the furniture. Philip bolted upright, his breath catching. For a moment, silence. Then, a laugh, low, guttural, bubbling up from beneath the floorboards. A sound so thick with malice that Margaret felt it vibrate in her bones. The house shook. The walls groaned, the very air distorting as something unseen moved within them. A force older than memory, older than the foundation of the house itself. Philip grabbed Margaret's arm, his own fear now stark in his face. Go. Go. They didn't take anything, didn't stop to turn off the lights, to grab their belongings. They ran, stumbling down the stairs, the air around them alive with something furious, something awakening. The front door, swollen with age, resisted just for a second. Then it gave way. They stumbled into the night, breathless, panting, hearts hammering. Behind them, the house stood silent. Not a single window was broken. Not a single sound came from within. The glass from the mirror was gone. The house had erased the evidence. But Margaret knew. Philip knew. The house did not want them. It had let them leave. But it would not be empty for long. Somewhere, beneath its floors, behind its walls, deep within the space where reflections were not merely reflections, it was waiting for the next owner. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.